It's no fun when our kids are sick, but we may just have found the silver lining. Apple and raspberry and orange flavoured electrolyte slushies made by Rehydrate.
Rehydrate slushies are a tasty way to get essential electrolytes into our little ones when they're dehydrated from sickness or even just the Aussie heat. They're delicious and they'll help your little ones feel better in no time. Grab Rehydrate from Coles today. The data shows that when we have perfectionistic tendencies, self-esteem declines, feelings of well-being go through the floor.
It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
G'day, this is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the author of 6 books about raising happy families, and I'm here with my wife, Kylie, Mrs. Happy Families, the mum to our 6 daughters. Kylie, I've got some really cool news. I got an email earlier this week. Somebody sent a link to me. We've shown up in a publication that I haven't heard of before, but apparently they're important. It's called Media Week, and our podcast got a mention.
Really?
Yeah. And not only did our podcast get a mention, but it got mentioned in the same sentence as Hamish and Andy's new podcast.
Hamish and Andy, the Hamish and Andy.
I don't know any others, just Hamish and Andy. So they've got the number 1 podcast in the country and everybody loves, or number 2 podcast or something. Everybody loves Hamish and Andy. And somebody okay, so we're not anywhere near them. let me just, but the reason that I'm mentioning this is because Media Week have highlighted that last month there was a brand new entry into the top 100 Australian produced podcasts in this country, and we were it.
Does that mean we're the 100th?
No. We're actually well inside the top 100. I mean, we're not in the top 10 or anything like that. We can't even say we're in the top 50, but we're in the top 100 Australian podcasts that are produced in Australia, and with all Australian content. I was like,
wow,
how awesome is that?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What's so amazing about that is not so much that it's a celebration of you and me, but it's a celebration of all of these parents out there who are listening because they just want the same thing you and I want. They just want a happy family.
Yeah, and some solutions when you're time poor and you just want to, figure out how to deal with this thing with your kids. So to everybody who's listened to the podcast and put us into the top 100, thank you. I mean, just so awesome. Feels really nice to know that there's thousands and thousands of people who are trying to perfect their parenting and make things work out just that little bit better in family life.
Well, I have a confession to make because up until recently, I actually haven't been a podcast listener at all.
So Luke and Susie used to interview me every week, and we'd have a conversation about how to make families happier. And I'd be like, "Oh, you got to listen to," and you're like, "No, don't listen to podcasts."
It's just really tricky. Like most of my driving is, 2 or 3 minutes down the road. And so kind of putting on a podcast for a few minutes.
That's why it's the podcast for the time poor parent. But anyway, I know it's tricky.
But over the last few weeks since I've joined you, I've actually been a little bit curious about what went on before me. Right. Because people have been kind of saying, different things. They've missed hearing from Luke and Susie.
Yeah, we had some really nice feedback about how much people love what Luke and Susie do.
Yeah. And so I was a bit intrigued, and I thought, you know what, I'd really like to kind of just get a sense of what went on. And I have to admit that while I have absolutely loved listening to all of the wealth of knowledge that you bring to the table, it left me feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I don't know if it's because I was binge listening, but now that I'm your co-host, I'm feeling a little bit inadequate.
Well, as a parent or as a co-host?
Oh, both.
Oh,
both.
Right.
Luke and Susie are amazing, and they do such a great job. So definitely that. But just, as I listen to all of the different strategies that you share for parents, who just want those answers, quick solutions to everyday challenges, it just highlighted to me how many times I get it wrong. And it was actually.
Sorry, honey. don't want to make you feel inadequate.
No, it really just highlighted, that there's a wealth of knowledge that you have shared with me over the years that has made such a positive impact in our lives. But I can't be that person 24/7.
Yeah, but totally off script here. You've got to remember that I don't make any claims to being a perfect parent. I get it wrong all the time. You see me get it wrong all the time. And this is not the Perfect Parenting podcast. It's the Happy Families podcast. It's aspirational. Like we're trying to help families do better and be better, but nobody's trying to be perfect. And it's impossible for us to do that. It's too hard. Although a lot of parents try to be perfect. And I think that's where we actually get ourselves into trouble when we put those expectations so high on ourselves that we can't possibly live up to them. And sometimes, I don't know, I mean, Instagram, hello, it feels like everybody expects us to be that perfect. And it's not fair. It's the Happy Families podcast, not the Perfect Parenting podcast. Although that is a pretty catchy title.
Well, I know that for myself, as I've listened and I've focused on all of the things that I'm doing wrong, my week has been not.
There's a phrase that I use all the time: where your attention goes, your energy flows. So if you're focusing on all the things you're doing wrong, if that's where your attention is, well, all of your energy is going to be going into the things you're doing wrong as well. And that can't be helpful. That's not going to make your family flourish. It's not going to help you to thrive. Your focus needs to go. Well, your attention needs to go and your focus needs to go on what could go right, because your energy will follow that focus.
Well, I was thinking about this conversation and just obviously my experiences this week, and I was wondering if we might kind of, put on your professor hat.
I was never a professor, but I was a lecturer for a little while at university, so we could do that, yeah.
And I thought that we could, really kind of unpack this idea of perfectionism. I think that, we definitely know people in our lives who, strive for this excellence that is just beyond
real.
Real, yeah. So I want to ask you a couple of questions after the break.
It's the Happy Families podcast.
Imagine a home where discipline got results without anyone having to feel bad or in trouble. The Do's and Don'ts of Discipline is a webinar to help parents set limits with love, compassion and humanity. Find it now at happyfamilies.com.au/shop.
It's the Happy Families podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. And we're talking about perfectionism and the quest for perfectionism in parenting. And you have some questions for me, Mrs. Happy Families. So I'm putting on my lecturer hat for just a moment, and we're going to get very serious about being perfect.
Can you tell me what perfectionism is?
Yeah. So the research literature is really clear on this. Perfectionism, and like academics argue all the time about definitions, but we've got pretty good consensus on this. Perfectionism is a combination of two things. First thing, excessively high personal standards. I just have to be flawless is essentially what we're talking about. And the second thing is being extraordinarily critical in your self-evaluations. So not only do I have to be perfect, but I never will be. Like, it's such an unfair thing to do to ourselves. It's so cruel. And we expect so much of ourselves when we have that perfectionistic tendency. We're basically saying, I must be the best, but I never will be. I never can be. I never will. It's just not doable.
And I guess that was my experience this week, just, kind of having this expectation of what I should be able to do as a parent, because I'm, number one, married to a parenting expert. I should know how to do this stuff. And then number two, recognizing that I can't even come close.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, there's three types of perfectionism. It's worth highlighting this really quickly as well. The first is called self-oriented perfectionism. And that seems really adaptive, right? That's about saying, well, I've got to be great. I've got very, very, very high standards. But what happens when your standards are that high is you realize that you're never going to achieve it. And so then you actually stop trying. And it becomes self-defeating, and it does not lead to excellence. It doesn't lead to good outcomes. It leads to feelings of depression and feeling lousy because you just can't measure up. So not healthy at all. That's self-oriented perfectionism. The next one is called other-oriented perfectionism, and this is basically when you expect everybody around you to be perfect. And this is something that some parents fall into the trap of. They look at their kids or they look at their partner and they're like, well, I expect you to be better. I expect you to do this right. I expect you to never fail. I expect you to be the most valuable player on the team. And that other-oriented perfectionism is really, really challenging.
Does that kind of tap into parents who want their children to be better than they were?
Yeah. That's part of it. Well, I guess it depends on the motivation for why and what it does for their identity and their kids' identity. And this is the critical thing here. Perfectionism is really about identity. There's nothing the matter with having high standards. There's absolutely nothing the matter with being conscientious and working hard towards goals. The issue is when you start to classify your value as a human based on how well you achieve those goals.
All right. So you said that there were three.
Yeah. So there's self and other-oriented perfectionism. That's the first two. Yep. The one that's most debilitating, though, and I think this is the one that is a really big challenge, is what's called socially prescribed perfectionism. And that essentially is when you think that everyone else has excessively high expectations of you, Or, you're scrolling through Instagram and you're like, look at the life that everybody else is doing and this is what I'm expected to live up to.
Yeah.
And then you get this combination of self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism where you think everyone is prescribing this to you, but you also feel that you have to live up to it, and then you put the pressure on yourself as well. So you feel like there's there's pressure coming from outside, but you also put it on you.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword, really, isn't it?
And it's toxic. Like the data shows that when we have perfectionistic tendencies, self-esteem declines, feelings of well-being go through the floor. The data shows that, in fact, this is really kind of heavy stuff, but pretty much every major psychopathology, anxiety, depression, even suicidal ideation, much more likely to occur in individuals who are perfectionistic. Just terribly, terribly toxic.
So you've talked about what the negatives are. There are plenty of negatives too.
Yep.
Are there any positives to being a perfectionist?
So there's some people that talk about how there's this idea that you can have positive perfectionism. I don't like it. I don't think that it's an adaptive way to use the phrase. I think that the term perfectionism should stay in this silo that says stay away from perfectionism. It's not helpful. There's nothing the matter with saying I've got high expectations and high standards, but perfectionism is about my value as a person. And it's just not fair to say, well, because I didn't attain that certain standard, I'm not a valuable person. That's what I don't like about it. So there would be some academics who would argue with me and say that perfectionism is healthy in some ways. There are adaptive kinds of perfectionism. But what they're really saying, I think, is that it's good to be conscientious. It's good to work hard. It's good to have high goals. And I would agree with that, but I wouldn't call that perfectionism. I'd call that persevering and having fortitude and being conscientious. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so if and I'm not saying I am, but if I am a perfectionist
and wanting to be the perfect parent,
what do I do with that? How do I work with this? How do I get to a point where I can, accept limitations or set standards for myself that are actually achievable without accepting a life of mediocrity? Because that's not the person I am.
So I'd call that a false dichotomy. A lot of people say, well, if I'm not going to have these really high standards and be perfect, what am I going to do? Just be average? I'm just going to be like everybody else. That's not good enough for me. And I think that's, we're going from one extreme to the other. You can still have high standards. You can still want to be the very best parent or the very best partner or the very best employee or the very best whatever it is that you value that you can be. But there's a difference between saying I want to work hard and improve and I want to be the best, or my value as a person comes down to this. There's this thing called the perfection paradox or the perfectionism paradox. And what it basically is that we learn by making mistakes. Okay, that's how we get better. We have to make mistakes because as we make mistakes, we recognize that we need to adjust what we're doing so that we can get better. That's how we learn. When we avoid mistakes, therefore, we limit our learning. But because perfectionists hate making mistakes because then they show that they're not perfect, they tend not to learn.
And so in your effort to be perfect, you actually curb your learning, which means that you actually can never be perfect.
Yeah, spot on. So I would do two things. Number one, so there's this idea that we're supposed to celebrate failure. I read it in blogs all the time. I see it on social media all the time. Celebrate failure, celebrate mediocrity. It's like nobody's if the kids come home and they've got an F on their report card, or if you get fired for underperformance at work, or if the house is falling apart because everything's just a schmozzle, you don't sort of walk in the door and go, "Look at this, we're failing. How amazing! We're celebrating. Let's have a party. Let's go and buy some cake." That's so unrealistic. It's a stupid thing to say. But what I think we can do is we can say. We can shift our focus and say, I'm not so interested on the outcome. I'm more interested in the process. My goal here is to learn to become a better parent. And if I fail, if I get it wrong, if I yell at the kids, if I don't get my life together the way I'm supposed to as a parent, what can I learn from that so that I can be better tomorrow? It's not about being perfect. It's about this ongoing becoming, this ongoing development. And that's why every Friday we have this conversation about I'll do better tomorrow. Why? Because we're not trying to be perfect. We're just trying to do better tomorrow.
Yeah, I love it.
And by the way, the thing that I love about it most of all is that it's tremendously self-compassionate. Some of the things that we say to ourselves, if you think about the last, when you were listening to those podcasts and you were thinking that you weren't a good enough mum, what kinds of things did you say to yourself about yourself? I don't know if you want to share that or not. I'm putting you on the spot.
I think the biggest one that stands out to me is I'm the weak link in our family.
Well, and you can see how damaging that statement is.
Yeah, it was
Now,
broke my heart.
I'm going to get a bit weepy when I say this, but can you imagine if one of our children was struggling and you looked at her and said, "You're the weak link in our family"? Like, you just wouldn't say it. So if you wouldn't say it to somebody else, why is it okay to say it to you?
You got me crying too.
Isn't this a big? This is a big deal, though, right?
Yeah,
because we say such awful things to ourselves. You know, we don't have to call ourselves names. Sometimes we just say, "Well, I'm the weak link. I'm the failure. I'm the." But you wouldn't say it to your mum, and you wouldn't say it to one of our kids, and you wouldn't say it to our neighbour. You wouldn't say it to a friend. We've got to be more compassionate to ourselves, not to everyone else, although that's important too, but we've actually got to just be kinder to ourselves. And if we can learn how to do that, that is where we move away from perfectionism. And at no point are you saying, well, I'm going to accept mediocrity. What you're saying instead is, I had a really lousy day with the kids today. I haven't been the mum that I want to be. And while it's not okay, I'll do better tomorrow. I'm going to learn from today.
That's a message of hope. So we've obviously talked about what do I do if I'm the perfectionist?
Yeah.
But is it easy to actually spot it in other people? And especially, I guess, as we're talking about families, in our spouses or our children.
Yeah, you can spot it. You know, perfectionism really just comes down to one thing. How do I feel about failure? How do I feel about mistakes? And if you've got a partner or a child, or if you've got somebody close to you who won't try things because they're going to make mistakes, as opposed to not trying things because they're not motivated, there's a difference. Or when they do try something, they fail and they say, I will never do that again because I hate feeling stupid and looking dumb. Then they're moving towards perfectionistic tendencies. And that's where we give the same strategies, you know, some compassion. We talk about learning. We say, well, how would you do it differently next time? And we've got to, it's critical that we say, whether you do this right or whether you fail, you're still okay. It's not a reflection on who you are as a person. And that compassion, that softness actually helps people to know that it's okay to make mistakes. That's why people listen to the podcast, right? Because we all know that we're making mistakes, but we want to be better tomorrow. That's, I think, the central message.
Well, things got a bit personal there, and I feel like I had a little bit of a therapy session with everybody listening in today.
Oh, I need some tissues as well.
But I'm so grateful, not only that you're my husband, but that I can pick your brain as an expert with these issues, because I think that it makes such a difference for families.
You know, I think it's really funny because on this podcast, we talk about stuff that we don't necessarily talk about in the humdrum of everyday real life. And I love having these conversations with you. If you enjoy the conversations that we're having, we would be so grateful if you would jump onto Apple Podcasts and tell everyone about the podcast. Let people know what you think. When you do that, Apple's algorithm bumps our podcast up and it helps other people to find out about us so that they can make their families happier, but not necessarily more perfect. And we would love it if you would be able to do that. Just go to Apple Podcasts and leave your rating and review and help other people to find out about the podcast. We appreciate so very much. Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. He's our producer, and our executive producer is Craig Bruce. And if you'd like more info about how your family can flourish, visit happyfamilies.com.au.